Radio.ie hosts the Irish History Show podcast because history matters. Radio turns 100 years young this year. Radio's history is powered by Radio Archives. For radio archiving solutions from people passionate about radio, visit radio.ie.
Hello and welcome to the Irish History Show. My name is Cathal Brennan, and as always I'm joined by my co-presenter John Dorney from theirishstory.com. Please check out our friends from radio.ie for all your radio archiving solutions. You can find this episode and all our previous episodes on our website irishhistoryshow.ie. You can follow us on Twitter @IrishHistoryPod or on Facebook, facebook.com/The Irish History Show. If you get a chance, please rate and review the show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. It really does help us. And if you hear an episode you like, please share it on your social media. We are really grateful for all the support we receive from you, the listeners. And to mention again, we've recently put up all the episodes on YouTube. So if you'd like to listen to your podcast through YouTube, you can find the show there as well. John has set up a Patreon for the Irish History Show and the Irish Story, and if you would consider supporting the show, there is a link in the show notes, and thank you again. Now, the last episode that we did was about elections in Ireland, and it's such a vast subject. We've had to split it up into 2, maybe 3 episodes. We'll see how we get on. Now, as we left the last episode, John, we had just come up to the end of the Williamite Wars, and we had the Treaty of Limerick. Can you do a brief sum up there, where we left the listeners?
Right, so there is a war between two kings. In Ireland, it was known as the War of the Two Kings, the Jacobite Williamite War. In England, the Glorious Revolution. And it ends with the victory of William of Orange, who is the stadtholder of the Netherlands, but becomes also the king of England, Ireland, and Scotland. And this means various things, but in Ireland, it means really the victory of the Protestant interest, and as it becomes known, the Protestant Ascendency. In England, the Glorious Revolution is remembered totally differently. So it is the victory of the Protestant interest over the Catholic King James, but it's also the victory of liberty over tyranny in the English narrative. So it isn't without some justification. So they had a civil war in mid-century, the king against the Parliament. The Parliament won, but also lost in the long term because the king gets restored. But in the Glorious Revolution, in some ways, they consolidate the demands of the Parliament in the 17th century. And what is this? Well, one of it is that the king has to be a Protestant, and there's a series of anti-Catholic legislation, which we'll get onto. But more importantly, I suppose, or more importantly in the English Whig tradition anyway, is the fact that the king can no longer rule without Parliament. He must have a Parliament. And initially, I was surprised to discover, you dug this out, Cathal, but even at this early stage, there had to be a Parliament every 3 years, or elections, to the Parliament every 3 years. Later on, it's shifted out to 7. There is a Bill of Rights of the citizen, so the king can no longer rule kind of by decree. So it is a big deal. It is the first step on changing Britain into kind of a parliamentary monarchy or a constitutional monarchy. Really, I mean, there was elements of this before, as we talked about, but elections become a regular and routine aspect of British governance. And the Parliament begins to take, throughout the century, part of the function of the executive as well, which it never had before. Even in the time of Cromwell, it didn't have. So it's a big deal, the Glorious Revolution, much exaggerated in Whig history.
Yes, and it's not just a British phenomenon. You can see in America too that so much of there's things named after William and Mary, this idea of like Catholic absolutism versus Protestant civil rights, civil liberties, something that the Orange Order always says in Ireland are civil and religious liberties. So it's all about like this is forward thinking, and Protestantism and Whiggery, for want of a better word, is the progressive forward thinking political philosophy.
Yeah, and I mean, the irony is that in Ireland itself as well, like the patriots of the late 18th century, the Protestant patriots like Henry Grattan and his companions, they were Whigs themselves, and even people like Wolfe Tone originally, said that they wanted to complete the work of the revolution, and they meant the revolution of 1688. So they believed that they were coming from that tradition. Now, the irony, of course, in Ireland is that the Whig tradition in Ireland also meant anti-Catholicism, and it meant that, basically the exclusion of the vast majority of the population.
Basically, 3/4 of the population.
At least,
Yeah.
if not more,
Yeah.
about 80% maybe,
Yeah.
by some estimates, from the political system. So it's an irony there. And I mean, it is a big contradiction, as the Whigs themselves, acknowledged. Like a famous Irish Whig, William Molyneux, said, all men by nature are in a state of equality, and only by their own consent can give up their freedom by entering into civil societies, which is a perfectly laudable sentiment, except for 80% of his compatriots in Ireland were by definition excluded unless they would take an oath to kind of abjure their religion.
Yes.
Not only recognizing the king, incidentally, as head of the church, which was already there, but also the oath contained things like saying transubstantiation was wrong and so on. So deliberately, explicitly contradicting Catholic teaching.
Yeah. You couldn't really be both.
No.
Yeah, if you took this oath. Now, the thing is, two words we're going to mention a lot in the context of elections in Ireland in the 18th century are Whigs and Tories. And we have this, the rage of party, this idea of political parties really coming to the fore in the early 18th century. Now, the funny thing that a lot of people probably in Britain don't realise is both Whig and Tory are Gaelic words. One coming from Scottish Gaelic, one coming from Irish.
Yeah, so this comes from the kind of partisan politics of the Restoration, and the terms themselves are actually leftovers from the Civil War of mid-century. They're terms of abuse,
Yeah.
Tory is an Irish word. Tore mean pursued man. So these were what was left of the Catholic armies of the 1640s.
Yeah.
Were pursued by the Cromwellians, pursued men, anglicised as Tory. And so when the supporters of King James and the supporters of monarchy and the rights of kings are being abused in England by their opponents, they call them, no, you're nothing but Irish terrorists, Irish criminals. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Tories. That's where the term comes from,
Yeah.
which is very odd, or odd to our ears, And the other thing is, in the 18th century, the early 18th century, after the defeat of the Jacobite cause, the Tories are the less anti-Catholic faction, which is, again, strange to our ears because Tory has a long subsequent history in Ireland, of course. Whig, similarly, is a term of abuse. It comes from,
Quig Gaboher.
Yeah, so like cattle thieves, basically, from the lowlands of Scotland. But again, it's associating them with kind of Scottish Presbyterian radicals who dethroned the king and so on.
Yeah.
And so it's a term of abuse, and the abuse on that side is you're really, Commonwealth men, Cromwellians, you want to cut off the king's head. You don't believe in law and order at all. And funnily enough, these two terms of abuse become formalized as kind of early political parties in Britain and Ireland, actually.
And not the only examples of...
And America, for that matter, actually.
Yeah, but it's not the only examples of terms of abuse that are eventually adopted by the people who are being abused with that. Like suffragette was initially used as a condescending or mocking term for women who wanted the right to vote, and then they adopt it as their own term.
Right, or Fenian maybe, for example,
Yeah. So as you were just saying there, the opponents of the Whigs portrayed them as Puritans, Commonwealth men, ultra-sectarians.
Yeah.
And the Tories...
Fanatics is another term of use,
And the Tories are viewed as like Jacobites and...
Papists. Tyrants.
Yeah.
This kind of thing,
Yeah. But one of the things that happens after the Treaty of Limerick is the Irish Parliament is not really pleased with how accommodating and reconciliatory that the Treaty of Limerick is. And they go much further in disenfranchising the Catholic majority.
Yeah, and I mean, this is one of the contradictions about the Irish Parliament of the 18th century, because in some senses it's kind of independent-minded, and at various points they want more independence and so on, and they want to get rid of Poyning's Law, which we talked about the last time. But they also represent the Protestant interest, which is a minority interest. And remember, at this point, it's very much the established church. So dissenters and Presbyterians are not really in the club either. Now, interestingly, the Whigs are much more tolerant of dissenters than the Tories. The Tories don't like dissenters at all. But no, the Irish Parliament meets. These are people who believe that they've been delivered from tyranny and probably from massacre by the victory of King William. Their intention is that whereas Catholics or Jacobites got conciliatory terms from King William and from his general Ginkle, they weren't going to go for that. They were going to make sure the Catholics would be kind of destroyed as a political power. So they passed a number of anti-Catholic legislation. Like, first of all, they refused to approve the terms of the Treaty of Limerick, which guaranteed the rights of religion, religious toleration, and landholding and equal citizenship and so on. They get rid of that. And they also pass additional anti-Catholic legislation. So first of all, Catholics can't sit in Parliament. They don't lose the vote, interestingly, until 1728. So Catholic...
That's surprising, isn't it?
It is surprising.
Yeah.
So Catholic 40-shilling freeholders are still voting up until then. Quite a lot, Or free men of the city as well. But they're also struck off the urban rolls in the 18th century. But it takes a while, though. But they lost the right to hold office right away, 1691. They were excluded from the Lords only in 1716, interestingly enough. But they lose the right to vote more or less throughout the 18th century. Like, they still have the right to vote up in 1728, but they lose it until 1793. There's no Catholics elected to office between 1691 and 1829.
In the early 18th century, the Tories are pretty much still in control. The Stuarts are still on the throne. The Tories are still in control of the actual government, both in Britain and in Ireland. And something happens then with a succession crisis, because there's no further Stuarts to sit on the throne. And there is a pretender, James III, eyeing up the British throne. When we get into the accession of the Hanoverians, the very far distantly related royal family, but the only Protestants that they could find along the line, there's a lot of Catholics among the Stuarts. This brings a period
from Hanover in Germany.
From Hanover in Germany.
Hence the Hanoverian succession.
Hence the Hanoverians. And that long and still enduring tradition of Germans on the British throne. We have this period of Whig dominance.
Yes.
Because the Whigs are very, very pro-Hanoverian.
The Whig tradition is, Protestant Ascendency and religious and civil liberty. That's how they present it anyway.
For some.
They don't include Catholics as being...
No.
As deserving of liberty. I mean, but the one of the differences between the Whigs and the Tories is that the Whigs are tolerant of dissent. Various sects that had sprung up in the 17th century.
Yeah. Most importantly, Presbyterians,
Quakers, Baptists, and so on. So some of the sects, particularly Baptists and Quakers, are explicitly associated with Cromwellian period and kind of republicanism. So there's a political dimension to it too. And the Whigs are easier on that, whereas the Tories see them as disturbers of order, and the established church. And as we said, the wrinkle in Ireland is that, like, a lot of kind of people who've previously been Jacobites, they managed to find a place for themselves for a time in the Tory establishment, because the Tories aren't as worried about Catholics, as Catholics have been subdued, and you don't need to worry about them so much because at least they support the right of kings and so on.
Yeah, and they view them as pretty much a spent force.
Whereas the Whigs are, in Ireland anyway, the Whigs represent people who are very worried about a possible Jacobite restoration. And not without reason. Like, there is a fashion among Irish historians, or there was a fashion, to resurrect the fears, if you like, of the Protestant interest in the 18th century, and saying the Penal Laws were a reaction to the fact that there's a Jacobite pretender. There's Irish Jacobite regiments in the French and Spanish armies whose explicit aim is to restore the Jacobite throne and to take back all the lands that they lost, more importantly. But be that as it may, the Whigs, as you said, become the dominant force, both in England and Ireland.
Because we are discussing elections. There is an election in 1713. And one thing that we should say as well is that regarding elections, Britain has moved on in this period. They've updated their rules regarding elections. And in the period of the Glorious Revolution in the 1690s, you were looking into there that they were having more regular elections.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the British in England and Scotland, because Britain becomes a thing from 1707, from the First Act of Union, but they start to have regular elections every 3 years and they push it out to 7. Whereas in the Irish Parliament, it's still the old medieval system where there's only an election, a general election, when a new monarch is declared or crowned. So this means that the elections in Ireland are fairly few and far between, except for by-elections, because when an MP dies, obviously, there has to be an election. But just a few words about the system of election. Like, we covered some of this the last day, but there are 3 types of constituencies. There are the counties, who elect 2 MPs each. They're elected by property people of over 40 shillings. There's the urban constituencies, where the electors are people of property and the free men of the city, so members of the guilds. And there are the boroughs, which are the most numerous. And the boroughs represent property, and the boroughs have no relationship whatsoever to the population that lives there. So famously, there are 3 boroughs with no people at all living in them. And as you mentioned to me before, Cathal, one borough with no buildings even.
Yeah, I was reading about Banno in County Wexford, and it said not only does it not have any people in it, there's no buildings in it in this. So these are known as pocket boroughs,
Yeah.
but better known to our ears as rotten boroughs.
Yeah, so radicals at the end of the century start to call them rotten boroughs because they point out that this has no representation whatsoever of people, But the idea, the principle here, and I said this the last day, is that they're representing property, not people, because the origins of Parliament are basically just to approve taxes. Now it becomes a lot more than that, but that's how it came about. So, but there are no general elections in Ireland between 1715 and 1727 and between 1727 and 1760, which is a very long time. There's
Yeah.
quite a few by-elections, but no general elections.
Yeah, and
This is because of the long reigns of various kings.
absolutely. So, like, by-elections become, much more important. But, to our ears now, listening to this, the fact that it further removes Parliament from any connection with the general population. Not that people could vote for it in the first place, but when you can go decades without an election to the body other than by-elections.
Yeah, and even though actually the property threshold is not that high in the 18th century, the fact that you've excluded most of the Catholics, which is again 80% of the population, all of the Catholics for most of the century, again means it's a very small proportion. Now, the exception to this is before the Catholics lost the vote, which again is 1728, and urban areas. So we're going to talk about an election in 1713 where it is contested. Now, just before we do, again, what an election consists of in those days is you assemble at a public place, like in Dublin is typically the Fálsa, I think, which is kind of like the town hall, and you have to declare your vote publicly, and it's noted down. Now, by this point, as we noted in the last episode previously, it wasn't always noted down, but by this point, it pretty much is. But where elections are contested, they can be pretty fractious.
Yeah, looking at the Dublin election or the Dublin constituency in the general election in 1713, we saw that elections used to be held at the Bluecoat School on the north side of the river, but it's moved to the Tolsel. As John said there, a building associated with the Dublin Corporation. This was viewed as a Whig stronghold. So this leads to a big riot. The city guards and the authorities have to come, and one person actually loses their life, and then they have to get to the stage to quell fears and quell the violence is that the Tories will all vote in one location and the Whigs will vote in another. So our concept of like secret ballots and everything like this, it bears no relationship to the way elections were held back then.
Absolutely out the window. Now, the subtext to the violence is really mostly kind of sectarian, I think, because this is before Catholics have lost the vote, and it's a fight between Whigs and Tories, and the Tories in Dublin are very much associated with proto-Jacobitism or crypto-Jacobitism, and so on. So it is recorded that the rival mobs insulted each other. The Whigs insulted the Tories as papists and Jacobites, and the Tories called the Whigs Puritans and Commonwealth men. So this is the subtext. But Dublin at this point is a majority Protestant city, and two Whigs are elected, John Burton and John Foster.
Yeah.
Now, we should say also that in rural constituencies, which are most of them, most elections are not contested still. Or if they're contested, it's by very few people. Because a lot of places have very few voters, first of all. And secondly, even where there are some voters, they're typically very well to do, and they can just arrange before them an acceptable candidate to all of them. That's still, going on medieval precedent. However, there are some constituencies where there are a lot of not very well off voters, and they are known as pot-walloping boroughs. The reason they're known as pot-walloping boroughs is because rival candidates would typically try to bribe people by feeding them. So they would bang their pots and say, "You'll give you better meal than the other crowd." Or sometimes they would just straightforwardly bribe them.
Yeah.
And interestingly, the most corrupt borough in Ireland was Swords, North County Dublin. So far from where you're from, Cathal.
No, and a lot of people would associate it now with Ray Burke, the former Fianna Fáil minister.
Well, I'm glad we put the corruption in the past.
Yes, yeah.
But just, the accounts of Swords, which is notorious throughout Ireland for being the most corrupt borough, in the sense that what happens is basically, and this is according to the work of Suzanne Forbes, who has an article on elections in Swords called Always Rowdy, Violent and Colourful. The problem is that there's no established landlord family to basically dominate everybody. Like, even in a so-called pot-walloping borough where there's a lot of poor voters, and there is a dominant landlord family, you're not going to vote against them because there's going to be consequences. They're going to know who you voted for. In Swords, that's not the case. There's not a big dominant landowner. So the voters, such as they are able to sell their vote to the highest bidder, and they do. And according to Coleman Dennehy, the townsfolk of Swords effectively sold their vote to the highest bidder. Swords had the meanest class of citizens whose venality was as black as the pots that qualified them. And elections here were always rowdy, violent, and colourful. Notoriously, every election that they had in Swords, there was just a straightforward contest in bribery. And in England, this is known as treating.
Yeah.
So it's again one of these things which radicals highlight about how corrupt the electoral system actually is. But you can imagine like it must have been fairly chaotic an election like this. And this is not an election where there's really much in the way of sectarian or political animosity going on. This is purely a case of jobbery, as later generations would say.
Yeah. But we can see that, you know, with by-elections and stuff that come up, there's a bit of local colour, and the ordinary people think, well, maybe we should get something out of these elections.
Yes, and again, and this is taking again from David Dixon's work on the history of Dublin. There are elections in Dublin in the 18th century which are fairly fiercely contested, and there are issues which are not just sectarian. So in 1749, there's a by-election in Dublin which is fairly fiercely contested, and rival guilds chose different sides. So the rival candidates are Lucas and Latouche. There's an electorate of 3,500, which is quite a lot. So that would have been... the population of Dublin is about 70,000 at the time. So it's not a huge number by our standards, but it's not an inconsiderable number.
Yeah.
It's fairly rowdy. There's a lot of rioting in 18th century Dublin. There's no effective police force. So it's either call out the troops or let them at it, is the thing. Guild members, interestingly, had demonstrated outside the House of Parliament protesting against an act of union in mid-century because they figured it would destroy Irish trade, which they may have been right about. But this election, Latouche is elected but disqualified as he had used undue influence on voters, which again probably goes back to the bribery. Lucas, his opponent, fled the country accused of treason for his attacks on the castle administration. So we should remind listeners that whereas there's an Irish Parliament, power in Ireland lies in Dublin Castle and the appointees of the British government.
Yes. So we can see that one of the things that we mentioned in the last episode becomes a real bugbear for Irish patriots, and that's Poynings Law and the constitutional system that we have in Ireland in the 18th century.
Yeah, so we discussed Poynings Law the last time. It's originally a medieval law, but what it did originally is that no laws can be initiated in Ireland by the Parliament without the approval of the Privy Council, which is represented by the Lord Lieutenant, or the Lord Deputy. It begins to be called the Viceroy in the 18th century, but the guy who lives in the finished park anyway.
Yeah.
Secondly, Poynings Law also says even if legislation is initiated, and approved in the Irish House of Commons, it must also be approved in the English House of Commons in Westminster or the British House of Commons before it can be passed. So it really neuters the Irish Parliament. And even though it's a parliament which is dominated by the Protestant Ascendency, which is not entirely, but in large part, settlers really from England and Scotland, they really buck against this in the 18th century because it's disadvantageous to Irish trade and Irish interests. So there's tariffs between England and Ireland, or Irish goods have to pass through England before being exported, and so on. So they buck against Poynings Law in various ways throughout the 18th century until we get to Henry Grattan and the Patriot Party of the late 18th century.
And this thing is one thing that we should mention as well when we're talking about this sense of patriotism, proto-nationalism that's growing in the 18th century regarding the Irish Parliament, that in 1731 we actually had a new physical parliament, a new building. And for anyone who's been to Dublin, particularly people outside Ireland as well, it just dominates this area of central Dublin, College Green, in between Trinity College, the end of Dame Street there, and you have this beautiful building which is now the Bank of Ireland. But it was the first purpose-built bicameral legislature in the world. And it's an incredibly impressive building. But you have all these people inside, all these parliamentarians, all these members of the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And maybe there's a realisation here that the majesty of the building doesn't really match up with the fact that they are this rubber stamp of Westminster. They're really a neutered parliament.
One thing that's striking about 18th century Dublin is that it isn't a backwater, really, like we probably think of it. It's one of the largest cities in Europe, actually. It certainly has one of the grandest parliament buildings, as you say, in Europe. And the Parliament building really becomes a focus of political action. So, as I said, the guilds of Dublin are quite strong, and they will demonstrate outside the Parliament against things that they don't like, whether it's a proposed act of union, which they didn't like, or also proposed regulation of the guilds and banning of combinations, which are kind of early trade unions. The guilds represent employers and workers, whereas a combination represents only workers. But the point is that Thames Street, College Green, the Parliament is a focus of political activity. So the common people of Dublin certainly are very politically active, and they know that there's a Parliament there. They try to influence it. It's not irrelevant to their lives in the way that the medieval Parliament probably would have been.
Yes, and that idea of when Parliament is in session and the Lords and the MPs are arriving at the building, they could sometimes have to jostle through hostile crowds who are angry at some piece of business that the Parliament is undertaking.
Absolutely, yeah. And Jim Smith, in his great book, Men of No Property, about Irish radicalism, makes this point that the populace of Dublin certainly was quite politicised before the decade of the 1790s, the revolutionary decade.
Yes, and this is the thing that is always a problem when you're reading history backwards and you see things in a 20th century or early 21st century lens, that when we're talking about the growth of patriotism in Ireland as a political tradition, the Irish volunteers, the early 18th century Irish volunteers, these are people who would have seen themselves very much in the Williamite tradition, in the tradition of the Glorious Revolution, but they're very much Irish patriots.
100%. And this one of the really interesting things in Irish history that modern Irish nationalism and many of its precepts actually come from Whiggery,
Yeah.
So Jim Smith, again, whose book I'm a great admirer of, writes that, the patriots and the radicals in the 1790s in Ireland came from what they called the revolution principles. And they meant the revolution of 1688, the Glorious Revolution, which means, among other things, the right of resistance to tyranny, the balanced constitution, the check on arbitrary power, religious and civil liberty. These are all solid Whig principles. And this is, the basis of modern Irish nationalism. Because before that, you have essentially Jacobitism, which is many things, but which is ostensibly a belief in the divine right of kings and of the Stuart dynasty.
Yeah, and it's really tracing back to an earlier, much earlier sort of Old English or Anglo-Norman idea that while we may be loyal subjects of the crown, we are our own kingdom, the Irish kingdom. There's nothing above it bar the crown. We're not subservient to Westminster and the English government.
Yeah, now that said, straying a little bit away from electoral politics here, among popular Jacobitism in the Irish language, it's really something else. I mean, it's really a form of popular nationalism. Like, if we can talk about nationalism in pre-modern society, like it's belief that Ireland is different from England, that the Irish will one day drive out the foreigners, and they often also say drive out the heretics. It's fairly sectarian as well, but like it's popular Jacobitism talks about the king who'll come back across the sea. The Ashling is favorite type of poetry. So popular Jacobitism and elite Jacobitism are actually different things. But that said, the patriots of the late 18th century are Protestants. They draw on the Protestant tradition, the Williamite, the Whig tradition, and there's no doubt about this. The United Irishmen of the 1790s, who were the founders of Irish republicanism, draw their roots from this. And of course, getting back onto our topic, one of their initial key concerns is actually electoral reform.
As we can see that in that decades-long stretch between a general election in Ireland, we have an election in 1761, and you would think there's all this pent-up enthusiasm that this will be such a huge event, but the amount of constituencies that are actually contested is very, very low. This idea of elections being a foregone conclusion, why even bother? Because it's very expensive to run for Parliament. That, as we mentioned there, rotten boroughs, and the other word being a pocket borough. Like, where does pocket come from? It's literally in the pocket of an aristocrat. It's in their gift to decide who will represent this borough. And the Irish House of Commons has 300 seats, but what percentage of them are actually contested at elections? Quarter, maybe less, 20%. It's elections don't have the same resonance then.
Until the late 18th century. And this is, the Irish politics are very much a mirror of English and continental politics as well. So, first of all, you have the Patriot Parliament under Grattan, which demands basically the overturning of Poynings Law and free trade. And famously, they have a rally with the volunteers, the original volunteers, saying free trade or this. And this is a canon. So they get that. But Irish reformers and radicals then think, well, what's the next step?
Yeah.
Parliament must be representative. This is the same as in England and in America, of course, the American Revolution, no taxation without representation. But the idea is Parliament should be representative of the people. Constituencies should be of equal size. Parliaments should be regularly elected. And then they come across a problem in Ireland, the radicals do, which is that most of the purported electorate are Catholics and are excluded because of their religion. So very early on, there's a fusion between the Catholic Committee and the early United Irishmen over this issue of reform. So the Protestant radicals are really interested in reform along what they see as rational Enlightenment lines, and the Catholics, the Catholic Committee, are initially interested in equal rights for Catholics. And the two merge at a very early stage, like Wolfe Tone sits on the Catholic Committee. And this is where it comes from, but it comes from the idea of electoral reform.
And we can really see this evolution of Whiggery from like this completely anti-Catholic movement. And at that stage, when you were talking about like the Irish volunteers meeting in College Green demanding legislative independence for Ireland, they're not just assembling at the Irish Parliament, they're also assembling at the statue of William of Orange.
That's right.
There's nothing incongruous about this to them at all.
Yeah, and some of the early United Irishmen, like Thomas Drennan, who's a Presbyterian United Irishman, and says the Catholics of, he said in 1784, the Catholics of the day are absolutely incapable of enjoying political liberty, or what is the same thing, political power. It must require the process of time to ameliorate in their hearts the capability of enjoying the blessings of freedom. This is a United Irishman says this.
Yeah.
Now, Tone goes against this, but the argument that he uses, Wolfe Tone, is that don't worry about it because Catholicism is on the way out in Europe. You know, reason and rationality is taking over.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting and very contradictory to, you know, the straightforward line of Irish history.
And not all patriots are in favour of Catholic emancipation.
Right. So some of the patriots of the 1780s become the reactionaries, if you like, of the 1790s.
Now, one of the things that comes out of, as you're saying there, this great growth of patriotism and radicalism, and as we mentioned there with Poynings Law, is we get something in 1782, which is the Constitution of 1782. What does that mean, John?
So the Constitution of 1782 is effectively the independence of the Irish Parliament, overturning Poynings Law, so it can no longer be dictated to by the Parliament of Westminster. And it is also things like free trade, you know, the free trade between Britain and Ireland. So it can no longer be disadvantaged in economic terms, is the idea. Now, it's a pretty incomplete revolution because Dublin Castle is still the executive, it's still appointed from Britain, still has control over most of the levers of statehood. Although you are seeing a kind of Irish government appointed by Dublin Castle by this point from the Parliament. It's an incomplete revolution, but it is a step on the road towards the idea of an independent Irish Parliament, which is not just a subservient Parliament to Westminster.
Yeah, we don't really have government in the shape that we would see at a later stage, with the Parliament electing its own Prime Minister and Cabinet that's going to carry through their own business and rule the country through the House of Commons.
Yeah, no, you're starting to see a bit of that, though. Like, even in the 1790s, you have a very hardcore element of the MPs in the Parliament who are appointed by Dublin Castle as a kind of executive. So what radicals called the junta,
Yes.
you know, the Foster and Fitzgibbon and Beresford, who are kind of like a cabinet. They do govern the country along with the Lord Lieutenant. So you're starting to see the emergence of something like that, actually, but it's cut off, of course, by the Act of Union.
And we're not just looking at Parliament as the source of popular politics in Ireland. As you were mentioning there with the United Irishmen, it's very important to put the actual time, the context that this is happening. Like you mentioned there, 1782 and the new constitutional settlement in Ireland. What's coming about at that stage? We're talking about America, 1776.
Yes, this is the Age of Revolution. So the American Revolution begins in 1776 with the original principle, no taxation without representation. So originally what the American colonists are asked for is that they not be taxed without having representatives in the Parliament at Westminster, actually. And later on, of course, it escalates and they declare independence. The principle is there. These are good Lockean revolution principles.
Yeah,
you know?
Another great Whig.
Yeah, this is Whiggery, effectively. But again, in 1789, you have the much more radical events in France.
Yes.
Where a Catholic monarch is overthrown by his own people who declare the sovereignty lies in the people.
Yes.
It takes a while for them to declare a republic, actually, and to actually execute the king. But these are tremendously radical events and transformative events. So in Ireland, first of all, revolution in America is a fill up to the idea of the British citizen and liberty and so on. But the French Revolution shows anything is possible. So people like Wolfe Tone argue, look, Catholics can throw off tyranny. So we must unite with the Catholics, those of us who are in favour of reform and equality before the law and equal representation and so on. They're tremendously disruptive events for Ireland. Now, of course, it all ends, because we romanticise, I think, the era and the 1798 rebellion, but it ends in this most appalling bloodshed, a lot of which is sectarian and a lot of civilians are killed and so on. But the ideas of the time are certainly very transformative for Ireland.
Yeah, and we're talking about a period now, 18th century Ireland, but more specifically Dublin, where you have the growth of printing presses, popular newspapers, pamphlets, and all these ideas are percolating throughout Irish society about political philosophies. All the stuff we mentioned there before about the American Revolution. But with the French Revolution, the idea being that you can completely radically overthrow the existing order and start a new order.
Mm-hmm. And the idea, the Rousseauian ideas and so on, sovereignty lies in the people and the social contract that they make. Actually, this also has roots, though, in the English 17th century revolutions, but that there would be universal male suffrage, which, of course, was never accepted in the British tradition. No female suffrage as yet, but universal male suffrage. That you would have a republic, and the republic would represent the general will. You know, these are vastly subversive ideas in the society of the time.
Yeah. Completely revolutionary in an era, as you mentioned earlier, where political power, where political representation is based on property ownership.
Right. And interestingly, I mean, an Irishman, Edmund Burke, is one of the great critics of the French Revolution. And he says, these abstract, who was a Whig, by the way, Edmund Burke, these abstract principles are all very well, but what you'll end up with is chaos and anarchy. Now, at the risk of sounding like a reactionary myself, there is something in this, because the French Revolution did end up in anarchy and tyranny, I would say, in the short term. Now, not which is not to say the principles are wrong, but Burke may have had a point about, you know, the speed of revolutions and so on, in my view.
Well, as we move into 1798, we can see the scale of bloodshed that this provokes. And that's not to say that the revolution was wrong, but the scale of reaction in response to it creates enormous bloodshed in Ireland.
It does. I mean, you know, no one has effectively counted it yet. Like, I know there is a project, Colin O'Rourke has a project to count them, but, you know, the deaths are in the tens of thousands, you know. It might be as much as 50,000. You know, the lowest possible projection is 10,000. And this is in about 3 months in 1798, in the summer of 1798. A lot of it is sectarian, and there is sectarianism on both sides. And one thing, because again, I think we romanticize the United Irishmen now as the non-sectarian revolutionaries, but one of the things that they do is actually stir up sectarian animosity by spreading rumours that there's an Orange extermination oath, that the Orange men are coming, were newly founded, of course, are coming to kill the Catholics, and they recruit people on this basis, you know, and they recruit the Defenders, which is a Catholic-only secret society. So all the accounts of the time mention these things, and I think we romanticize it a bit too much. But talking just about elections, one of the interesting things is in 1790, which is just before the storm, if you like, there are quite a few radicals elected to the Parliament, including people like Nat Tandy, who's United Irishman, and so on. In 1797, there are elections in Dublin anyway, and they return Conservatives. So by that time, it appears that the Ascendency, who have the most stringent repression by this point, I mean, they have martial law, they have hangings of people without trial and so on, but they do effectively control the elections in 1797. They're not what you would expect.
Yeah, and we've also just seen the attempted landings by the French in 1796.
Right.
So Dublin Castle are now very, very wary of a French-style revolution in Ireland.
Absolutely. Although the Ascendency and the British really don't believe that it's a French-style revolution. They really believe it's a Catholic mob.
Yeah.
You know, that we may disagree with them on that, but and I think that's very patronising, of course, but that's what they believe.
Yeah.
They think it's a few clever Protestants who have stirred up the Catholic masses. That's what they think.
Yes, and we can see as well, we would imagine that this is a period of great success for the Patriots, that we've had 1782, we've had the volunteer movement, we've had Henry Grattan at his absolute peak of his powers.
Mm-hmm.
But by the time that the 1798 rebellion comes along, they're all completely demoralised, especially Grattan.
Yeah. And one interesting thing, again, talking about electoral politics, is there is a brief moment of success, very brief moment of success for Grattan in 1795, when the Lord Lieutenant Fitzwilliam, who is a Liberal, appoints Grattan basically as head of kind of the executive. It's kind of like the Prime Minister, really. And the intention is to push forward with Catholic emancipation and electoral reform. But what is known at the time as the Ultras, feel like the conservative Protestant interest, manages to get Fitzwilliam recalled after just 3 months. And this is an underappreciated moment in Irish history because it's the last chance for peaceful reform, really, before it all slides off into violence.
Yes. You know, there's another episode to be done on 1798, or 3 or 4 episodes to be done on 1798.
Yeah.
So we can really sort of talk about the aftermath of 1798 and both the British and the Irish government's response to this. And one of their responses, their main response, is to abolish the Irish Parliament.
Right. And so, interestingly, like the Lord Lieutenant by this point, Cornwallis, another Liberal, funnily enough.
Yes.
His vision of it is, you've had this appalling violence in Ireland. And again, their analysis of it is it's basically sectarian violence. Some part Jacobin, but mostly papist, is what they say. You'll have the Act of Union, you'll have just government from Westminster, and you will have Catholic emancipation to go with the Act of Union. And the problem is a little bit like the Treaty of Limerick, really, in that the Irish Parliament and the Ultras, as they call themselves, the Junto or so on in Dublin Castle, they won't go for Catholic emancipation with Union. Like, one of the groups who is most against the Act of Union initially is the Orange Order, because they believe it's going to bring with it Catholic emancipation. And the Catholic Church, by contrast, actually supported the Act of Union, because likewise they believed that it would bring with it Catholic emancipation, which eventually it did, but not for 30 years or so.
Yeah, that's the thing, because there's so many ordinary Catholics in Dublin don't have that connection with the Irish Parliament that you would assume they would, as this symbol of independence, the symbol of a separate Irish jurisdiction, as they can't vote for it.
But
there's no Catholics sitting in it.
We should mention that there is like Catholic relief in the 1790s. There is some reform. So Catholics get the vote in the 1790s. In 1795, they regained the vote. So Catholics did vote in the election, for example, of 1797. But no, it is as yet still an all-Protestant parliament. And so what's left is Catholic can't sit in parliament. Or they can't hold public office of any kind, including in the military, and they can't bear arms and so on. So some of this has been abolished by the 1790s, but a lot of it remains, particularly the right to hold public office is the big bugbear.
Yes.
And we should mention also, this is famous in Irish history, of course, but the House of Commons on College Green, first of all, votes down the Act of Union, and then there are copious bribes and so on, and they finally voted through on the second occasion.
Well, that's how it's mainly remembered as the largest widespread bribery in Irish history.
Yeah, so but the Irish Parliament and the British Parliament are combined in Ireland sends MPs to Westminster from 1802 up until 1922.
Yes, so this passed in 1800. That's the end of the Irish Parliament. And we've seen an Act of Union, as you mentioned there earlier, in 1707 between the Parliaments of Scotland and England. And now we have another Act of Union between the Parliaments of Ireland and Britain.
And one of the interesting things about the Act of Union is actually it brings Ireland into the British system. And now there will be elections every 4 years. It gets rid of many of their archaic practices. But you still have the same electorate and the same constituencies. Up until 1832, the Representation of the People Act in Ireland redraws most of the constituencies at that time. But before that, you have Catholic emancipation. First of all, an election is key to getting emancipation.
Well, this is the big thing because, like, it's been mentioned recently, and we've done goodness knows how many episodes about the decade of commemorations, that decade between 1912 and 1924, and it's been so heavily commemorated in Ireland, all the different events that happened during that time. But there's not a lot of mention about a very important anniversary that's going to be coming up in a couple of years' time, and that's Catholic Emancipation, 1829. And that is a huge event in Irish history.
Absolutely. And from the point of view of elections, like there's a famous election in 1829 where Daniel O'Connell, who of course creates the Catholic Association, and he campaigns for Catholic emancipation, but he runs for election knowing that Catholics have the vote, he might get elected, but he cannot sit in Parliament. So it's a form of radical protest. It's a form of moral force, as O'Connell said. O'Connell is very unfashionable nowadays and always derided and so on.
Yeah.
For me, O'Connell, for all his imperfections, because O'Connell is like an elitist and he doesn't have much interest in social questions and he doesn't have interest in the Irish language, despite the fact he's an Irish speaker. O'Connell is still a master politician for my money. He deals with the Ireland that he has, not the ideal Ireland that the United Irishmen imagined.
Well, he's a giant of Irish history.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons why he has this success and Catholic emancipation actually comes about is this idea of harnessing the general population into what is probably the first modern democratic movement in Europe.
Yeah, and people at the time actually talk about this all the time. I recently read a book on the revolutions of 1848, and there are many mentions of O'Connell by constitutional liberals all across Europe saying, look at this man O'Connell, he could mobilise the masses behind a liberal demand for constitutionalism. So O'Connell is a very famous figure, also famously an abolitionist. He's an associate of Frederick Douglass in America. But, he's underrated in Ireland today. But the election in question is in County Clare. Remember, Catholics have the vote. Catholics of 40 shilling freeholding and above have the vote, which is a lot of people. The electorate's quite large in the early 19th century. Still don't have the secret ballot. And what this means is you have to be extremely disciplined, because if anybody breaks rank at all, if there's any split, then you'll have a problem, because those people can be victimised.
Yes.
So O'Connell brings this whole organisation to County Clare. There is a 3-day ban on drinking declared by the Catholic Association. And for all the stereotypes, a lot of them are kind of true. There is a lot of drunkenness in pre-famine Ireland.
Yeah.
And post-famine Ireland, I suppose. But there's a 3-day ban on drinking. The people file in, they declare they're voting for O'Connell, and O'Connell's elected. While it's not the only thing, like it's their mass meetings and so on. And there is sort of an implicit threat of insurrection. O'Connell never makes any explicit threats, but like there are numerous kind of small agrarian uprisings around the time, like the Captain Rock Rebellion, the Tithe War, and so on. The Tithe War is basically simultaneous with Catholic emancipation. Emancipation is finally conceded by the Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley, himself, interestingly, a descendant of Old English landowners.
Yeah, and had once sat in the Irish Parliament.
Yeah. But Catholic emancipation, of course, a pivotal moment in Irish history, because Catholics can hold public office. But there's a twist in this, which I don't think many people are aware of. In return for Catholic emancipation, the electorate is massively cut in Ireland.
Well, this is one of the things that people criticise O'Connell the most for, that he accepts Catholic emancipation, but it's going to disenfranchise a huge amount of Catholics at the same time.
Yeah, and O'Connell himself had actually said he was in favour of universal suffrage. And while he did not get on with Fergus O'Connor, who was the Irish leader of the Chartist movement in England, he was in favour of universal suffrage. And yet he acceded to a radical cutting of the electorate. So post-emancipation, the electorate in Ireland would be only people with property of over £10, which is a massive step up from 40 shillings.
Yeah, big difference.
Like, it cuts the electorate, I think, by something like 80 or 90%. And why would O'Connell go along with this? Well, one explanation I have from James H. Murphy, who's a historian of 19th century Ireland, is that O'Connell said, yeah, okay, we'll lose the 40 shilling freeholders, but in a normal election, most of them will just vote with their landlord anyway. Landlords are virtually all Protestant and so on. We have enough people of property to carry the seats that we're going to get anyway. And so O'Connell doesn't worry too much about losing the 40 shilling freeholders. O'Connell's very, he's a very cold-blooded politician. We shouldn't romanticize O'Connell either.
But was he in a position to reject it?
No, I mean, I guess you take what you have.
What you get.
I mean, Wellington, who accedes to Catholic emancipation, is a Tory as well.
Yes.
But he has a little bit of the old school Tory. Like his ancestors were Catholics, Old English Catholics in Ireland. So possibly that's something to do with it as well.
Yes, and I suppose we were coming to the end, really, of this episode, because we wanted to end around the period of the famine. Because after the famine, you get into the whole period of the Irish Parliamentary Party, the Home Rule movement, a reorganisation of politics within Ireland.
But just before we do, though, I mean, I want to talk a little bit about the franchise movement in England as well.
Yes.
So I've been reading a little bit about this lately, and it comes from similar roots to Ireland. It comes from the radicals of the 1790s, many of whom were religious dissenters as well. So again, there's a parallel with Ireland. Post the Napoleonic Wars, it's a time of great hardship, economically speaking. And that's when a lot of the demands for universal suffrage for the working man, if you like, come from. And famously, there's a massacre near Manchester at St. Peter's Field of people protesting for the right to vote. The cavalry, or the yeomanry, in fact, the same term as in Ireland, are set upon them and they sabre them. And this is known as the Peterloo Massacre, mocking reference to Waterloo. But in the 1840s, so in the time when O'Connell in Ireland is agitating for repeal of the Union, for the return of the Irish Parliament, actually, there's a famous Irishman of the day called Fergus O'Connor who was agitating for universal suffrage for the Chartist movement in England. Just a few words about Fergus O'Connor, because I had never been aware until recently of his own background. I had always assumed that Fergus O'Connor was like an Irish labourer who went to Lancashire to work in the mills, like Michael Davitt maybe.
Yes.
But no. In fact, Fergus O'Connor came from a landlord family who in the course of the 18th century had converted to Protestantism to keep their lands. A sensible tactic.
Yes.
But who in the 1790s became radicals, became United Irishmen. So his father, Roger, was a United Irishman, and his uncle, Arthur, was a senior United Irishman.
Lord Edward Fitzgerald. And
Lord Edward Fitzgerald, but I mean, his father and uncle were both United Irishmen, despite the fact that they're members of the Protestant ruling caste, of Gaelic ancestry, but they changed the name actually back from Connor to O'Connor to appear more Irish, which I had never been aware of. And Roger actually had sat in both in the Irish Parliament and in the Westminster Parliament. But Fergus O'Connor sets himself up in London as a radical really publishing a newspaper, and apparently a great orator, and possibly in a clash of egos, him and Daniel O'Connell fell out very badly and could not get on at all. Mm-hmm. So O'Connell refused permission basically for O'Connor to appear in Ireland. But in a similar way really to O'Connell, so O'Connell agitates with mass movements, huge meetings for repeal of the Union, for the return of the Irish Parliament, but this time with Catholics in the 1840s. Famously, in 1842, he calls a mass meeting for Dublin at Clontarf, and is banned, and the British government sends in the troops and so on. O'Connell backs down. O'Connell's put in jail for a period of time. And a similar thing happens in England. So there's a mass demonstration call for London for universal suffrage, and that's banned too. We should keep in mind, Ireland's history is not in isolation. There are a lot of parallels with what goes on in Britain and further afield.
While we're being heavily influenced by events abroad, events in Ireland are also influencing other people in other countries.
Yeah, absolutely. As I said, O'Connell is a major figure in 19th century Europe, and people really admire him as a Catholic who's also a liberal. It's a big selling point.
Yes.
Who can mobilise the masses, but not do bloody revolution.
Well, there you go. I think in our next episode, we'll cover then subsequent events after the famine, the great tragedy in Irish history, into the 19th century and then into the early 20th century. But is there any last points you'd like to make?
Yeah, just before we finish, though, I want to give it a flavour of an election in mid-19th century Ireland.
Okay.
And this is, again, after Catholic Emancipation, but before the secret ballot. And this is from a Liberal MP, Edward Leatham. And he says, in an election, and this is one of those rural constituencies, tenant farmers are collected by the estate agent, in some instances many days before the election, placed upon strings of cars, handed over to the military, escorted as prisoners, or believing themselves to be prisoners, by horse, foot, and artillery, and all the imposing paraphernalia of an army in occupation of an enemy's country, to the polling place, kept therein in forced custody with locked doors until the day of poll, not even permitted to avail themselves of the ministrations of religion, and then finally polled in the presence of the landlord or the agent. Now, allowing for exaggeration, because this is a man obviously in favour of reform, this is what an election in mid-19th century Ireland consists of.
Democracy in action.
Democracy in action.
So thank you very much for listening, everybody. If you want to find this episode or any other episodes of the show, you can go to our website, irishhistoryshow.ie. You can follow us on Twitter at IrishHistoryPod or on Facebook, facebook.com/The Irish History Show. And if you get a chance, please rate and review the show on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. It really does help us. John has also set up the Patreon. So if you do get a chance and you do want to support the show, we would really appreciate it. And the link is in the show notes. To mention again, our friends at radio.ie, you'll have to check them out if you need any radio archiving done. So on behalf of myself, Cathal Brennan, and my co-presenter, John Dorney, thank you very much for listening.
Radio.ie hosts the Irish History Show podcast because history matters. Radio turns 100 years young this year. Radio's history is powered by radio archives. For radio archiving solutions from people passionate about radio, visit radio.ie.